I don't know if you've ever taken strength finders. Anybody ever taken strength finders before? You ever done this? This is like a personality profile. So futuristic was my number one, which is probably good and bad. Good in the sense of like, I love to think about the future. I love to think about what's out there. I'm an early adopter. Like I buy the iPhone when it comes out just because it's new. It doesn't, like the camera's better, but I can't see any difference, but like it's new. So I want to do that. I'm an early adopter. I think about futuristic things a lot. But it's funny, like a lot of my friends don't. They think maybe 6 months out or a year out. And I oftentimes will live so far in the future that it's hard for me to stay present in the moment. And so when I was growing up, I would think about like where I was going and what I wanted to do a lot. And one of the things that I thought a lot about was being a Major League Baseball player. Now you looking at me, we're clear that wasn't going to happen. But anyway, but it wasn't gonna happen. So there was a part of me though that would think a lot about like, where am I going and what's life gonna be like? What's life gonna be like later? And so what I wanna do for many of you, how many of you are futuristic like me in the room? Do we have any futuristic people that you think pretty far out? Great. So if you're a futuristic person, I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of where you're headed. And if you're a person like it's a little bit harder for you to think that far in advance, I want to do an exercise to sort of get you thinking that way. So let's fast forward a little bit. We're going to fast forward to the year 2027. I think I did my math right. That is 5 years away, right? Yes, great. All right, perfect. So 2027, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about you in the next 5 years. Now, I want you to think about this when you're family, just for a second, right? So think about, like, what does your family look like if you could kind of fast forward that out? Like, what would a family look like for you in 5 years? I think about this with our son, Henry. He's 5 now. He'll be 10, so he'll be double digits, which means I think he might be a little bit of a smart aleck at 10, but I could be wrong, right? So do we have anybody who has 10-year-olds in the room? That 10 to 12 age, yeah, you get it. So you think about your family goals. I want you to think about like relational goals, right? A lot of people don't talk about this, but what kind of friend do you want to be 5 years from now? Like how are your friends going to describe your friendship with them in 5 years? Some of you have career goals, right? You're in the job that you are now, but for a lot of you, you don't want to be in the same position that you're in 5 years from now. You might own your own company. You might be an executive at your company. What's next, right? What's in the next phase of life for you? Now, when you think about that, like there's a lot of ways that you could think about it. You can think about the house that you want to build, which is great. You can think about that man that you want to marry, which is also great. Sorry, I said that looking at you guys. I'm sorry, I didn't even mean to do that. I looked at the one couple who's dating, so I made it so awkward for them. That's great. My bad. You have all that. You have like a promotion in mind. You have a college you want to be in mind. There's all these things that you think about. Now, where we're going to start, I'm going to give you all my cards from the beginning, and then I'm going to spend the next few minutes trying to prove my point. All right? I think all of those whats are very important and very good, and I think you should have them. Those things actually kind of pull us into the future and draw us into what we want to have in life. But this is where I want to focus most of our time today, and that's this, that who you hope to be, what you hope to do in 2027 will first and foremost be shaped by who it is that you become, right? By who it is that you become. Who you're becoming right now will completely shape the what that is coming in the future. And that's a huge, huge thing for most of us in the room because it's so easy to think about our goals. It's so easy to think about our resolutions. It's so easy to think about our one thing. It's so easy to think about in the short term the things that we want to accomplish or achieve. But the bigger question for you isn't going to be about all of the what's that come. Some of that you can control and some of it you can't. The bigger question for you is going to be about who it is that you become. So I put in my notes and said it this way: who always precedes do. I hate that it kind of rhymes, but it's fine. You'll remember it more, right? Who always precedes do, which means that when you think about your relational goals, right, there are pieces of that you can control, but there's a lot of that you can't. The parts that you can control really center around who it is that you're becoming. For those of you who are married in the room, for those of you who are husbands in the room, right, who you become as a human being is going to shape what becomes of your relationship 5 years from now. If you're a leader in the room and you know this, who it is that you're becoming and the way that you steward your influence over the next 5 years, who it is that you become is actually going to shape what's coming next for you, right? Deciding who is always the foundation of what you will do and experience later on. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at an area of the Bible. We're actually be looking at pretty much a big section or a chunk of an area of the Bible that focuses around a guy named David. Now, I always hesitate to talk about David because most of us, whether you've been around church or not, everybody's exposed to David because of the giant thing, right? Like little guy, We were taught this as kids, goes, a little slingshot, boop, giant falls down, look what God did, and then he beheads him, and then it gets weird. You know what I mean? Like, that's the whole story, and we tell our kids that before they go to bed at night. Like, sleep good, Henry, like, it's great. Now, usually there's pictures involved, which I also think is always fun. You know what I mean? Like, it's David, like, with one of these things. Now, the whole fun part about this story that most people leave out is the innovation around the weapon that David uses. So you have this, like, teenager-esque kid who got it appointed to be king. And a lot of people think about, well, all he had was stones. He didn't have a sword. But no, he actually took something that was extraordinarily innovative, took these stones, does this deal, and then essentially inspires an entire people group towards a new direction and a new future. And this kid sort of has this, I don't know how else to say it, but like this Justin Bieber-esque fame, and then the person who's above him gets angry and is like throwing, swords and spears at him, and there's jealousy involved. And then I love, if you've ever read this before, you should lean into this. And then you find a young man who submits to spiritual authority in an extraordinary way and lets God bring him into power and to bring him in as the king. Now, the area that we're gonna look at is almost like David's journal during some of these seasons. And you find this young man who becomes an old man throughout the course of the Bible, who makes extraordinarily bad decisions at times. He does extraordinarily bad things. In fact, when you look at his family, he has an extremely broken family towards the end of his life. He loses relationship with one of his sons. I mean, there's all sorts of pain and suffering, much of which David brings on himself. And the area that we're gonna look at is David's prayers to God about what his life could look like both in the present and in the future. And I'll tell you this, if you've been around church for a while, if you grew up hearing some of these stories, or if you've been around church and you've read through the Psalms before, it's so easy to read through them and just bypass them as poetic nothingness. But within these Psalms, you find the deep, broken humanity of a person who wants God's best and lives within the brokenness that oftentimes he brings in his own life. And so we're gonna be picking up at Psalms 25. I wanna read this to you within the context of what it looks like to move through our lives in this way. So let's look at this, Psalm 25, verse 20. I'm gonna be drinking tea for most of this, sorry about that. It says, guard my life and rescue me. Do not let me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. Now, you could read that really quick and be done with it. Like, that's sweet, cute. Thanks, David, with the little bow. But the idea of shame culture isn't something that we really think a lot about in the West. Like, you don't think about this very often. Shame culture is a big deal. When he says, don't let me be put to shame, he's not talking about, like, a walk of shame. He's not talking about judgment from friends only. He's talking about, God, don't let me lose what I've accumulated to this point. If you find yourself in this culture in a place where you've been put to shame, what happens is there's implications around every part of your life, your status, your wealth, and oftentimes even physical punishment in these ways, right? Now, the way that he talks about this is not in his own power and his own strength. What he says is this, guard my life and rescue me. And what he's talking about rescue from is himself. Guard my life and rescue me. Pull me away from the desires and the struggle that I have and rescue me from me. And do not let me be put to shame, or don't let me lose the things that I've accumulated. For in you I take refuge, or I've placed my trust in you. And then David goes on and he says this. He says, may integrity and uprightness protect me. And then he says, because my hope, Lord, is in you. Now, this is a part that I think is so important for us. Most of us were brought up in that you need to make wise decisions, because if you make wise decisions, then you're gonna get more of what you want, right? I'll never forget, I think I've told you guys this story before. My mom used to pray for me when I'd go on dates. Now, I don't know if she prayed the whole time. That's a long time to pray. But when I'd come back, she'd still be praying. So that's either like a ninja mom move, which may be true, but I felt that as a kid. And I'll never forget, as she talked about this, what she would talk about for me at least, was like this integrity that leads to protection. Not to get something, but to remove yourself from the regret of something else later. Now, it doesn't mean that bad stuff's not gonna happen, and it doesn't mean doing the right thing is always gonna bring good things. That's not at all what it is. It's saying when you walk in the ways that God has laid out before you, Like there is hope in God's way. I put it in my notes this way. I said this. I said, integrity is a pathway to God's best, but never a prerequisite to God's grace, right? Now, let me unpack this just for a second. Integrity is a pathway to God's best, meaning not that God has this like perfect, best, and if you never mess up kind of plan. I think he has a plan for your life. But it means this, that when you want to experience the kind of life that God most desires for you, it requires integrity, and what I mean by that is this protection and the alignment of the steps that he's called you to take. And the second part of this is just as important. And you've been around churches that'll only preach that and never the second part. The second part is that it's never a prerequisite to God's grace for you. There is nothing that you could do that would pull you outside of the power and the redemptive nature of God for your life. In fact, when you read through the scriptures, this is always so fascinating to me, God ends up taking the most broken things and redeeming them to make something beautiful. And this is so fascinating. Integrity, many times, is a way that oftentimes you experience it at some point in your life or later on in life, or you have seasons of ups and downs in this. And it's a pathway to experience the way that God wants you to experience the world. But it's never a prerequisite for experiencing the powerful redemptive nature of his grace. And this was true in David's life. In fact, if I could encourage you, especially if you're a skeptic, one of my favorite things to do is tell people to go read just the life story of David. It's one of the most human things you'll ever see because it's highs and lows, it's pain, it's all of it sort of wrapped together. And then in verse 15, what we find is you have this in sort of the 20s, but in chapter 15, you have this like prayer that David prays around this integrity thing. Here's what David says. He says, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? And we'll come to that in a second. And who may live on your holy mountain? So let me talk about this sacred tent, because you don't ever talk about sacred tent. It'd be weird if you did. It'd be a really weird first date conversation. You know what I mean? Somebody looks at you and says sacred tent. It's like, that was a real quick date. That was fun. Sacred tent, though, is an expression of two different things. It's an image that pits God, or Yahweh, against every other god that was projected or portrayed in the Old Testament, specifically Baal. And it says God sort of rests on this higher holy hill that oversees it all. And there's power in that. But more specifically, it's talking about the presence of God on a holy mountain around strength. And the cultural implications of this are so powerful because the people that would have been reading this would have looked both to God and to Baal, and there's almost this like sort of juxtaposition of it. And what he talks about is who may experience the fullness of your presence in the world. And he says, who may live on your holy mountain or experience the power of the actual God in the world. And then he answers the question with very practical things. He goes on and he says this. He goes, one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from the heart. And this is the part that I wish I could convince every single person of. If I had the chance to convince every one of you of this, I could sit down for coffee, it would be this. It's not in the highs and the lows. It's not when you're like living your best life, and it's not when you're living at your lowest point. I don't miss this. This walk is blameless is this step-by-step, unending rhythm of being in the world. It's a Tuesday. You know what I mean? Like Tuesday is just Tuesday. Like you get up, you brush your teeth, hopefully. You go to do what you're gonna do. It's the days that you end up at Target and spend way too much money, because it called you there. You know what I mean? Like, it's the days when your kids are just normal. They're good and maddening at the same time. It's just the days. And he said, and when David talks about who experiences the fullness of the presence of God, it's the person whose rhythm of life embraces integrity and alignment with God's will and our obedience. It's ultimately this, and this is the way that I best describe it to you. It's living above reproach. It's living so far away from lines that you're not even tempted to experience the regret that comes on the other side of them. And then David goes on and he says this. This person who experiences the power and presence of God is one whose tongue utters no slander and who does no wrong to a neighbor and casts no slur on others, which I think is so fascinating. Because ultimately, he's talking about the relationships that we have with other people. And he says, and it's also essentially he's saying this, it's being right with God is illuminated by being right with other people in the world. I'll tell you, if you want to know whose rhythm or walk in life feels blameless, it's the person who doesn't experience all of the drama by being wrong with so many different people. Now, that doesn't mean you're passive, and it doesn't mean that you're a pushover, and it doesn't mean that you don't stand up for things. It doesn't mean that there's not conflict. In any relationship, there should be those things. But it's a person who moves through their life in this like almost unforced rhythm of grace and blamelessness, and who seeks power and peace through the conflict and the struggle and the power. And moving through your life, and this is what's always interesting, going that it's not just this moment, but it's many, many, many more moments to come. And what is moving beyond those things. And then I love what he says next, because it's not quite profanity, but it flirts with it. But here's what he says next. He says, who despises a vile person, but honors those who fears the Lord. And I love this. That despises a vile, like the Hebrew word here for like vile is very, very blunt. And you don't read that to your kid tonight, right? But what he's getting after isn't that you despise necessarily the individual, but you despise the evil that would pull the individual away from God's power and God's best. And then he says this, and this is one of the most powerful ones. He says this. He says, and who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. Now, this is a tough one. Like, if I'm really honest, when he talks about being right with people in the world and living this sort of blameless life, this is true throughout all of the scriptures, but trust is the foundation for every relationship, which is why David talks about this. Trust is that foundation for every relationship that you're gonna have. And he says, look, you're guarding that sort of power and trust within it. And then he gets to my favorite one, right? And so we're gonna talk about this verse, which I think is so much fun. He talks about trust, he talks about relationships, he talks about all of these sort of things about leading this blameless life. And then he talks about money, and it gets really weird quick. So I can imagine like if somebody were reading this is often how this would happen. Like somebody's reading this psalm, it's all pretty and beautiful, and everybody's like, yes, don't lie, great, like all these sort of things. And then he gets to the heart of money, and somebody's reading this, and then everybody just kind of butt clenches real quick. You know what I mean? Because here's what he says. He says, and it's the person who dwells in the house of the Lord, and this experiences the fullness of God's presence, is a person who lends money to the poor without interest and who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Right, now let me explain what this means, because this is so misused so many different times. The literal translation of this in the Hebrew is a command to not put a bite down on another person. The image here is actually an image of almost like being entrapped by one of those little, is this making any sense? You know what I'm talking about? I could just keep doing it. Can we zoom in on this? No, I'm kidding. Like you get that, like that you are not entrapped by a person or manipulated by a person where that other person cannot move anymore. This is not just about money and interest and giving to the poor, which is an overly simplified interpretation of this text. It is about the manipulation tactics of making sure that you are the only beneficiary of your actions. He talks about manipulation in general. He's like, no, that cannot be a part of your story if you are going to experience the fullness of the presence of God. And David sort of summed this up, and he says this. He says, whoever does these things, I love this, will never be shaken. Not will never experience pain, because that's not true, and you know that's not true. Not will have an easy life, because also not true, and you know that's not true. But will never be shaken, that their core will never be shaken to the point that it crumbles, because their security and the power of living a blameless life. In another section, he expounds on this in a different way, and this is Psalm chapter 10. He says it this way. It says, whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Now, this is so fascinating to me, and I think this is one of the most interesting parts of the text, and we'll talk about this. Again, not what I was brought up with talking about. But as a human being and as a person who moves through the world, and don't miss this, the freedom that we most often desire does not come from us grasping at freedom. It comes from us walking securely through life. You ever met somebody, maybe they were older, like significantly older, I love this, and they're just not moved by things. You ever, talk to somebody who's experienced 2 pandemics, you know what I mean? Talk to somebody who's experienced, the loss of a child and they're in their 80s, if you've ever had this. Or talk to somebody who has lived long enough to not, honey badger don't give up. You know what I'm talking about? That's the person that I'm talking about. They move through their life, they're like, there's not this or that. It's just securely walking in safety. And when you do that, and when you're in the presence of those people, and I don't miss this, there's something that just feels inspiring about that person. And that person, I don't miss this, is not bound by your opinion of them. They're not bound by what might be thrown at them. They're just walking and moving with freedom. And this is what David's talking about. His integrity leads to that security. And security brings us what most of the time we most want, which is freedom. I've been in my notes to say it this way. The security ultimately brings freedom. All right, so here's what I want to do just for a second. David's teachings on this and his prayers essentially are so fascinating and so important. But within the context of the way that he talks about integrity and power and security and freedom, I want to go back to this number for you, right? If you were to fast forward 5 years to the future version of you, what would it take for you to feel like you could walk in that kind of security and freedom? And I'll tell you, it's not a financial number. That might help, and that might be one of the whats, but it's not a financial number. It's not and then I got married. Because if you get married, come on, all my married people, where you at? It takes about 11 seconds for you to understand that the worst parts of me get illuminated real quick, As soon as I feel secure enough in a relationship to be the fullness of who I am, I immediately need the grace of the other person that I'm with. Amen. We don't say amen here. No, but you know I'm right. You know I'm right. What would it take for you to feel secure enough in who you are as a person to not be moved by either side of those things, but to walk with freedom through the power of your life? To feel like you're not looking over your shoulder, or to feel like you hope that something happens but you don't have control over it, and so you are trying to grasp at things that aren't yours. What does it look like for you to move with the kind of influence of a person who isn't unsure about who they are? And not like what you're gonna do, but unsure about the core of who you are, because you know that your walk is blameless, not perfect, but blameless. So I'll tell you this, when I was 21 years old, I was working at a student ministry. Emily and I, so this is fun, Emily and I had broken up. And so I'm immediately thinking about my whole life, right? You get in a breakup with somebody that you've been with for a while, you immediately go, what's my future like without this person? And I wasn't there yet, you know what I mean? And so I was like, I think I was 21. And so I was doing that, and then I was also, for the first time in my life, actually speaking every week. And so I was wanting to get away to a cabin and start writing out messages. That's what I wanted to do, which should tell you how popular I was in college. I'm going to go write sermons. Yeah, that's great. So I get away to this cabin right around New Year's Eve. It was kind of in that, and it was beautiful. Like, it was on a hill. It overlooked everything. I didn't have to pay for it. Somebody donated it to me. Let me stay there. Because when a 21-year-old goes, I want to go write sermons, most older people are like, sure, you can have whatever you want. You know what I mean? Like, there's 3 of us in the world, right? I got away. And I heard a talk by a guy named Andy Stanley, who we ended up working with in Atlanta. And he talked about Stephen Covey's book, which is always fascinating. I think it's so funny. You had a guy teaching on the Bible, and then he starts referencing Stephen Covey, and people start losing their mind. And what he did is, the reference that he did to Covey was, if you're familiar with 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, it's that version where you fast forward to the end of your life, and then you write your eulogy from there. What do you hope people say about you? What do you hope your wife says about you one day? What do you hope your kids are saying about you one day? What do you hope that your parents might say about you one day? And your friends, the fringe people that don't know you, but that one day might. And so what I did is I got away, and I heard him give this talk, and I was like, I got to figure that out. And at the end of it, he talks about developing, we'll put this up there, developing your own personal set of core values. Now, I'd studied enough business stuff at this point in my life to know what business core values were, and mission statements, which is all great. But I never thought about this for me. I never thought about, what does a centered version of me look like? The kind of person who, the way that I'm wired, the way that I think, the way that I experience the world, has such clarity around what makes me me, and that keeps me within bounds that actually brings me freedom. And I love quoting Andy on this, because I thought it was so powerful. Excuse me. He said this. He goes, it's not about saying, here's like the guardrails, and then if you fall off the guardrail, then it all falls apart. It's about how far do you back that up to where that the smallest things, don't miss this, the smallest things feel like failure, even though the bigger failure is the one that you're most afraid of. And that just, that got me. And so I like to write. And so he's like, you should get like 4 or 5 core values that make you use. So I came up with 117 doing that Covey exercise. And I went to dinner by myself that night. Got myself a salmon, the kids' salmon. But because I'm a college student, I got myself the kids' salmon. And I sat in this restaurant by myself, and I just wrote them, and I wrote them, and I wrote them, and I wrote them. And he said this, and I started working through this exercise. He says, what's my personal definition of success? And this is how you develop these core values. And what's at stake if I don't achieve it? What's at stake for me if I don't achieve those personal core values? And that's what I wrote down. I wrote it down, and I went through that whole exercise. And so what I'm going to do is, I ended up getting 7 over the course of the last 10 years. I added another one, so I'm around 8. So 8 out of 117 is better. You know what I mean? So we're making progress. But I got to 8. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to share 2 of mine with you. And then I'm going to challenge you to do this over the course of the next week or month, however you process it. The first one for me, it's not number 1 on my list, but it's on my list. It says purity was one of mine, especially at 21 years old. You know what I mean? This is a big one for me. I would say I want to guard intimacy through exclusivity, right? So this is a value of mine. I don't know, I get a little bit emotional when I talk about these. Sorry, it's a big one. And for me, I said, if I don't do that, I diminish or eliminate intimacy in my most important relationship, which at that time was whoever I date after Emily, you know what I mean? And then we'd come back around, and Emily and I get back together, and I was like, I'm so glad that this is how you. Now, I take this to an extreme. So I'll tell you, this is me. Now, I'm a pastor, so that's another part of it. Because a lot of people have stories of pastors who don't do this well. And I take this to an extreme, and I'm awkward anyway. So if you talk to me for more than like 3.5 minutes, you'll go, oh yeah, I get it. He is a little bit weird. You know what I mean? He's enough awkward. But I'll tell you, for me, when we were in Michigan, we had a church. We had a pretty big building. It was probably about twice the size of the building that we're in today. And it had like an auditorium that said about 1,000 people. And so you could be in that building and never see somebody on the other side of the building. But we did this, and I was like religious about this. I would not be alone with people of the opposite sex in the building. I wouldn't do it. So it would get really weird. There's a few times where I'd go, and I'd be praying in the auditorium. And we had a lady that was over our kids ministry at the time, she was older, like she was in her mid-50s, and she would always get like, are you serious right now? Like, no one's asking this question. You know what I mean? Like, no. And we'd sit there, and I wouldn't be in the building alone with people. I would leave. There were times where I'd call Emily. There was a time where I had to take somebody, and it ended up like I had to take somebody somewhere who was I called Emily, I put her on speakerphone, because I didn't want any questions around this sort of stuff. A lot of people, like, I don't do one-on-one counseling stuff with women. I don't do that kind of stuff. And so I've been in elevators before. I step off elevators all the time. Like, that's the dumbest thing in the world. And you are absolutely right. It is so dumb, probably. And I remove myself as far away from some of those questions as possible. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't fail or couldn't fail in this, because I absolutely could, because I'm human and I'm a man. But for me, the question isn't about an affair, or the question isn't about even just, sorry, I know there's kids in the room, but whatever comes into that space. The question is about, do I feel failure far enough away from that to where I don't even fall into it, right? So purity is a big one for me. Now, this is a really personal one that you probably won't care about at all. This is another one for me. The other one is approachability. I am naturally introverted. I love being around people. But I'm both introverted and an extremely high-driven type A, that personality, right? Every time I take a personality test, it says all of these things, like some of them are nice, and then it gets to, here's your weaknesses, and you look at that, and you're like, he could be, and at the end it should just say, he could possibly just be a jerk. Like, that's the end, like, in his most unhealthy state, he's just not a good person. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of what it says. And so for me, this is one of the biggest ones for me, and I ask myself this every day. Approachable for me means consciously responding as if the person in front of me is the most important. And I pray this over myself before I go into meetings. I pray this over myself before I come on Sundays. And it's not that I don't love people. I love people so much. I love being around people. But for me, failure in this area is that someone feels like I'm not approachable. Because the other side of that is what I put it, is like say, if I'm not, I diminish or eliminate opportunities to actually invest in other people, which is what I feel like God's called me to do with my life, right? Now, these are two. One of them I think a lot of people should have, and then one of them is just unique to my personality. But I think you have to figure out a way to develop personal core values in your life so that you can move forward with the kind of blamelessness and integrity. The second thing is this. I think you have to pay attention to the details of the inner conversation that you're having with yourself, right? I put it in my notes, and this is something I'm always trying to pay attention to. Inner justification is almost always evidence of inner manipulation, right? Whenever you're trying to justify something to you, whenever that conversation is a justification for yourself, right? Especially, and this is kind of my role, if I'm having it more than one time, oftentimes it's you manipulating you to get something that you think that you want, but ultimately know that you shouldn't have, right? Like, this is something I try to teach my 5-year-old this, which is so much fun. But I'm asking, which is, because prefrontal cortex at 5 is ready for this conversation. But what are you thinking about? And what are you convincing yourself of? And we're talking about these kinds of things because the sooner you get this, the sooner you understand that the inner conversation that you're having matters, and then you're evaluating it, the better the red flags just start going off. Now, come on, everybody look at me just for a second. Whether you're 20 or you're 70 in this room, look. You know someone who convinced themselves of something that they should not have convinced themselves of. And the story that gets told on the other side of it is one of this, that's the deep thing. Now, hear me. Now, come on. And you have the power, and only you have the power to recognize the inner conversation that's happening and to redirect yourself. The greatest mark of maturity is not a person who does the right thing. It's a person who can evaluate the thought patterns that they're having internally so that they can then do the best thing, right? I wish I'd have put that up there. That'd have been better than whatever I just put up here. That's good. Shoot. All right, pay attention to the details. The last one is this, and then we're gonna wrap up here in just a second. I want you to identify what you hope you're never asked about. All right. Now, this is a question that I struggle with, and I have an accountability partner that we've been asking each other this for almost 15 years now. 15? Yeah, 15. But when I meet with people, and this is a huge telltale sign, what do I hope that they don't ask me about? There have been seasons of my life, especially in my early 20s, that it was finances. I didn't want people to ask me about why I was spending $45 at Applebee's on a steak that was terrible, you know what I mean, or whatever that is. Like there were times in my life, especially in high school, around purity, and like I hope my mom never finds out or doesn't ask me questions about pornography, like those kinds of things. There's these seasons of my life, and leadership are the same sort of thing. When you identify it, it doesn't mean you need to stand on stage and say, and here's everything I struggle with. There needs to be a few people that know that, but don't miss this. The more clear you can be about what you're actually trying to pull away from the light, the more likely you are to not have to deal with it later on, right? And so I'll tell you, when you think about this, there should be like sirens and buzzing and whatever else goes off in your mind and your heart and your head about what you hope that you're not asked about. And the more that these things connect to your core values, I think the more likely you are to experience a life with less and less and less regret, right? Now, I'll say this and then I'll say the bottom line and then we'll wrap up. Now hear me. Two things. Some people hear this and they go, oh, I'm doing so great. You know what I mean? And so I'm going to tell you right off the bat, everybody look at me. You're not, so let's stop that and let's lean into it further. If your immediate response is, I'm great, ask your wife. You know what I mean? Ask somebody who knows you. Now, you might be good, but for most people, especially with a third question, there's something that's flirting in that line that you need to illuminate. And for those of you on the other side of this, and there's a whole other side of the spectrum that sees this and goes, with my life currently, I don't feel anywhere near the things that you're talking about, and all you feel is guilt. Now, I'm going to tell you this. Now, hear me. That's not of God. Right? Just the deep guilt and shame, that's not of God. What is of God is the inspiration through the Holy Spirit to pull you in the direction of the life that He's called you to live. Right? Now, hear me on that. So if you're on the other side of this and you're all these things, like I could tell you, and I probably should have told you more and more stories about how I feel in this all the time. But setting those kind of boundaries far enough away from the failure that could lead you to deep, deep, deep regret, the more you can do that, the better. But I'll just tell you, the guilt thing and the shame thing and that, if you're on that side of the spectrum, that's not of God. What He's calling you into is the beauty of a relationship with Him. Don't miss this, where you walk in that rhythm of His unforced grace in the highs and the lows and the failures and the wins. So there's that spectrum. The middle section, which is most of us, here's what I would tell you. That the more you fast forward to 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, pick whatever your number is, to the life that you want to create. Now hear me, if you're especially in the middle section, the more inspired you will be to care about this. Right? Some of you have kids right now that are 5 years old like we do and 3 years old, right? It's easy for me to be wrapped up in this and not ask the question of who I'm going to be 5 years from now. Your kids need you to have clarity around who you're going to be 5 years from now so that you can become that person then, but become more of that person now, right? Husbands, come on, everybody look at me. You're already a good husband. You're great. High five. Your wife loves you. Like all this. You're a good husband. You're great. But look at me. You know this, especially in loving and serving your wife, right? You can be better at it if you know how you want her to describe you 5 years from now, because when that's in full view, it will shape you actually cleaning the dishes tonight, right? I was waiting for everybody to say amen on that. That was a good one. That was good, right? No, but that's true, right? Come on. And it's gonna move you in that direction. Last thing I'll say around this, and then we're gonna wrap up. I think we're just gonna wrap up because I think I talked for like 2.5 hours. I'm sorry, we'll wrap up. Let me say one, I'm real passionate about this one. Let me tell you the last thing, right? For those of you in the room, especially those of you who are leaders, please don't miss this. And there's a lot of you who are leaders in the room. Please don't miss this. Of all of the things that I think our world needs now, right? We need great moms, and we need great husbands, and we need great family people. But our world now needs extraordinarily strong and capable leaders who project the power of integrity. Now, don't miss this. And this is a lot of you in the room, right? And the greatest thing that you could ever do is determine who you're gonna be. not what you're gonna accomplish or achieve, not all of the ladders you're gonna climb. Because when you get to wherever it is that your talent's gonna take you, then you'll be a leader that's worth following. And that will inspire and shape every other part of the culture and the people that you're leading. So I'll tell you, leaders, come on, leaders, please don't miss this. Don't brush over this. Don't brush over just becoming more and more talented or gifted. Spend the bulk of your work becoming a leader who is worth following, and that people don't just admire from a distance, but admire deeply up close, because your walk is blameless. So let me do this. I'm gonna pray for us. Then I'm gonna have to give you another announcement, and then we'll wrap up. And then we'll hang out here. We'd love to hang out with you out here, especially if you're new. I'd love to meet you. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'd love for you to do this. I want to pray for you. I'm gonna ask you to do one thing, if you would. We do this every once in a while. I'm gonna ask you. You can just do it like on your legs. But I'll ask you to kind of open palm it just for a second. I'll tell you why we do this. This is just a posture of just not receiving, but saying, God, we're open and we want to be obedient to you. So if you're a follower of Jesus, especially, I'd love for you to do this. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you could humor me for 11 seconds and do it, or you could just not. But the open-handed posture is saying, God, I want to be this type of thing, and I'm going to pray that over you. And I think physically showing that actually does something to our hearts. So let me pray for you, and then we'll wrap up here in a second. So Father, God, we thank you that what you want for us is more than we even want for ourselves. And I ask wholeheartedly for every person in this room, for every mom, every dad, every leader, every husband, every couple that's dating, every friend, every person in this room who's navigating what this looks like. And I pray that as we fast forward in the future, that we're so clear on who it is that we want to become. God, that we would make decisions now that would lead us to become that person, both in the present and in the future. And God, I pray for the families who have no idea whatever trap might be laid for them in the future, that they're going to avoid because they took this seriously and they led with obedience. God, we thank you for that. We thank you for the stories that our kids are going to tell one day about people and parents who were worthy of following as parents, and also loved so selflessly that it shaped the hearts of people. And I pray for every leader in this room. God, I pray that you would help us all to be leaders worth following, and that you would help us in the depths of who we are to be so clear about who it is that we are called to be, that it leads us to walk securely and with freedom in every part of our life. God, lead us to be above reproach, and lead us to be people whose walk is blameless. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so that's week one. We'll come back next week and talk a little bit more about it. Thanks so much for being here. I did want to say this. We'd love to connect with you. So if you have a Connect card, we'd love for you to fill that out. You can put it out on your way out in the box, or leave it on your chair. Somebody will grab it. Also, I mean this, if we haven't met yet, I know I sound like a frog. I tested negative this morning. I promise. We are good. We are good. I mean, we've been tested negative for weeks. Yeah, you should shout for that. We're glad that we don't feel like crap. Anyway, we'd love to meet you out here. And I'd love to talk to you and hear a little bit more of your story, especially if you're new to our church. We'd love to meet you. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you right back here next week for part 2 of FutureU. We'll see you soon.